I'm going to pick up where Karen Prentice left off, and I'm going to talk about using resilience and resistance concepts to develop a science framework for managing threats to sagebrush ecosystems and sagebrush-dependent species. Although I'm giving this presentation, I need to acknowledge that a lot of different individuals contributed to this work. And you can see by the variety of logos that this has truly been a collaborative research and management effort. Now, there are 6 different components to the strategic multi-scale approach that is used in the science framework, and I'm going to be talking about those different components today. The first is to develop an understanding of ecosystem resilience and resistance for the planning area. The second is to identify key habitat indicators. As Karen indicated, the science framework really focuses in on sage-grouse, but it also discusses using indicators for other species and resource values. The third component is really to assess the dominant threats in the planning area, and then the following components use the sagebrush habitat resilience and resistance matrix along with the other components really to delineate focal habitats or areas for conservation and restoration investments and to determine the most effective management strategies. Now, Karen talked about the different regions and the areas that the prior general technical reports had covered. I just want to point out that we really do have some significant differences in both precipitation regimes and temperature regimes in our sagebrush ecosystems. Consequently, they differ in the specific species, the plant species composition, and also the dominant threats. For the purposes of the science framework, we're looking at really 3 sets of ecoregions that are associated with the different sage-grouse management zones. These are the western cold deserts, eastern cold deserts, and the west central semi-arid prairies. Now, regardless of the region, our sagebrush ecosystems occur along strong environmental gradients. In our cold desert systems, Wyoming big sagebrush communities dominate at low elevations with relatively warm and dry soils, while those mountain big sagebrush, mountain brush communities dominate at high elevations with relatively cold and moist soils. Now, because these systems differ in terms of both productivity and fuels, they also differ in terms of their relative resilience and resistance. For the purposes of the science framework, we define resilience as the capacity of an ecosystem to regain its characteristic structure and processes following disturbances like wildfire. In other words, it is a measure of the recovery potential of the system. We're looking at resistance to invasive annual grasses in particular. And when we talk about resistance to invasive annuals, we're looking at the attributes of the system that prevent the population growth of the species. Now, this graph shows that resistance to disturbance increases over elevation gradients in cold deserts, but it's modified by aspect and soils. There's a strong relationship between our dominant ecosystem types, our soil temperature and moisture regimes, and the resilience and resistance of these particular systems. Our higher elevation systems, those cold and moist mountain brush systems, are most resilient because they receive the most effective precipitation, they have the greatest productivity, and they recover more quickly after disturbances. Also, because they burn more frequently in the past, they have more fire-tolerant species. Disturbances that alter the community composition of our vegetation communities can significantly decrease resilience in these systems. And particularly important are those perennial herbaceous species, the perennial grasses. This graph shows that resistance to cheatgrass also increases over these elevation gradients. This is first because climate suitability is greatest in those lower elevation, warm and dry Wyoming sage communities, and lowest in our higher elevation mountain brush communities. Also, those higher elevation systems are more productive, the communities are more competitive with our invasive annual species in general. Now, disturbances that either increase resource availability or decrease those perennial herbaceous species in these communities can significantly decrease the resistance to cheatgrass in these systems. Now, in developing these concepts, we began by defining the predominant sagebrush ecological types for the western and eastern cold deserts, and then also for the semi-arid prairies. We then categorized them according to their relative resilience and resistance. And what you're seeing here are those dominant ecological types essentially for our eastern cold deserts, that Colorado Plateau area and the Wyoming Basin area. As an example, we can look at our cool and summer moist to dry type, frigic, oostic to aeritic in soil terms, and we see that the dominant shrubs are Wyoming big sagebrush and basin big and silver sagebrush in the drainages. These systems have moderate resilience and resistance. Now, because of the strength of the relationships of our dominant vegetation types to those soil temperature and moisture regimes, and then also resilience and resistance, we can use soil temperature and moisture regimes as a landscape indicator of resilience and resistance. The red colors essentially indicate relatively warm and dry conditions. These areas are characterized by low resilience. The blue colors indicate cooler and moisture conditions to cold conditions. These areas are characterized by moderate to high resilience. And I like to point out that this map goes a long way in terms of illustrating ecosystem responses to our predominant disturbances in the area and how these systems also are going to respond to management actions. The low resistance and resilience areas, those red areas, essentially are where we're seeing increases in cheatgrass. They're also areas where we're having the most problems in terms of restoration. The high resilience and resistance areas, those blue areas, are the areas where we would expect recovery of systems following disturbance given appropriate management. And we're going to hear a lot more about how to step these soil temperature and moisture regimes down and apply them from Jeremy Maestas in one of our next presentations. Now, for mapping purposes and analysis at this large biome scale, we combine the three different categories into blue, high resilience and resistance, yellow, moderate resilience and resistance, and then red, low resilience and resistance. There were some issues in terms of the mapping boundaries adjacent to Wyoming and then also Montana, and our Eastern Working Group resolved those, and in the current data sets, that is now a continuous layer that we can use for categorizing these systems. Now, in order to link our understanding of resilience and resistance with information on sage-grouse habitat, we used the sage-grouse breeding habitat probabilities that were developed by Kevin Doherty and his colleagues. The breeding bird habitat probabilities are developed from multivariate models that look at the relationships between the breeding bird density data and general climate, such as general habitat, such as the cover of sagebrush and then also conifers, climate, landform, and disturbance. For the purposes of the science framework, we categorize those breeding habitat probabilities based upon the probability of supporting active leks. In this map, you can see those categories. Yellow, 0.25 to 0.5 indicates low suitability. Magenta, 0.5 to 0.75, moderate suitability. And then dark blue, 0.75 to 1, high suitability. These particular models represent a significant improvement over looking at single habitat indicators such as the cover of sagebrush. And we'll be hearing a lot more about how these models are being developed and how they're being applied at more local scales from one of our next speaker, Pete Coates. Now we can combine our understanding of ecosystem resilience and resistance with our information on sage-grouse habitat in the sagebrush habitat resilience and resistance matrix. This matrix is one of the key components of the science framework. It essentially allows us to prioritize areas for management and determine effective management actions based not only on information on individual species like sage-grouse, but also on how these different ecosystems are going to respond to both disturbance and our management actions. In the matrix, the rows essentially indicate ecosystem resilience and resistance, the columns, the probability of sage-grouse breeding habitat. If we look first at those high resilience and resistance areas illustrated here by our mountain big sagebrush, mountain brush communities, we see that these have high restoration or recovery potential. Native grasses and forbs are typically sufficient for recovery, the risk of invasives is low, and seeding or restoration success in these areas is typically high. If we contrast that with those low resilience and resistance areas, our warm and dry Wyoming big sagebrush systems, we see that the restoration recovery potential is typically low. Native grasses and forbs are often inadequate for recovery. The risk of invasive annuals is high, and seeding success or restoration success in these areas is going to be highly dependent on site characteristics, the percentage of invasives in the community, as well as the effective precipitation. These areas may require multiple interventions for restoration success. Now, if we factor in the probability of sage-grouse breeding habitat, we can look first at that low probability, and we see here that the landscape context is often limiting for supporting sage-grouse. In order to make these areas suitable, significant restoration may be needed, and in many cases, it may not actually be feasible. That doesn't mean that these areas aren't important for management in terms of other species at risk or protecting other resource values. Now, if we look at the medium probability, what we see here is that these areas may provide significant opportunities for habitat improvement. Management activities might include increasing connectivity through activities like sagebrush restoration or conifer removal. They also may involve improving habitat conditions through stepped up invasive species management and then also improved livestock management. If we look at the final column, our high resilience and resistance areas, these are often our intact sagebrush communities that we want to manage to maintain and enhance both resilience and resistance. Protective management here might be stepping up early detection and rapid response of our invasive species that are coming into these areas, as well as more careful monitoring of livestock management. They also may include preemptive activities such as fire management activities, as well as conifer removals. Now, if we look in that bottom corner on the right hand, we see that these are our low resilience and resistant areas that support high probabilities of sage-grouse. These are the areas that are at greatest risk to our ecosystem threats, and in many cases, they're the most difficult to restore. As a result, they're among our highest priorities for management. Now, we can use geospatial maps and data to really target areas for prioritization. This map overlays the breeding bird habitat probabilities and resilience and resistance for greater sage-grouse. The first filters are those greater sage-grouse priority areas for conservation that were developed by the packs. If you look at the map, the blue areas indicate high resilience and resistance, the yellow, moderate resilience and resistance, and the red, low resilience and resistance. Darker colors indicate a high greater sage-grouse breeding habitat probability. Now, what's important about this map is that the management strategies in the matrix can be matched directly to this map on the landscape. And for example, if you look at those dark red areas, those are the areas where we have the lowest resilience and resistance and the highest breeding birds. Now, because of the large area currently occupied by greater sage-grouse, The population index model is a tool to better focus appropriate management actions. It is based on the breeding bird density. In this particular map, the population index is overlaid with resilience and resistance. The same basic color scheme applies. Blue represents high resilience and resistance, red, low resilience and resistance, and the darker colors, high greater sage-grouse populations, as indicated by areas with 80% of the breeding bird density. Now, using the breeding bird index ensures that when we select management areas, we're including areas that support large populations of birds, that provide connectivity among the different populations, and that are close enough to breeding centers for recolonization of the birds. When we begin stepping down to the land planning unit, we can couple our understanding of resilience and resistance with our greater sage-grouse breeding habitat probabilities and other resource values. At this point, we want to begin to overlay those dominant threats in the area, and we can use finer scale, higher resolution data if it's available, and rely on regional and local expertise. We can use Northwest Nevada as an example of how this works. This is an area around Elko. The packs are essentially the outlined areas, and the primary threats are illustrated here in the 3 different panels. If we look at the first panel, we can see that cheatgrass cover is relatively high in what are essentially low resilience and resistance areas with warmer and drier soil temperature and moisture regimes. If we look at the second panel, we can see that we've had significant large fires burn through this area in recent years. In particular, if you look at those orange polygons, those are the fires that burned in the 5-year period from 2004 to 2009. The last panel shows that there are pinyon and juniper, mostly juniper in this particular area, and observation on the ground would tell us that several of these areas are exhibiting conifer expansion. Now, when we overlay resilience and resistance with the greater sage-grouse breeding bird density, what we see is that large areas within the packs have high breeding bird densities, and they occur over a broad range of resilience and resistance. And as a reminder, those red areas are low resilience and resistance with high breeding bird densities. The darker blue are essentially high resilience and resistance with high breeding bird densities. Now, to develop targeted management activities, we can overlay the greater sage-grouse breeding bird densities with our understanding, our information on resilience and resistance, and then also with various land covers that can provide additional information on how we want to target our management activities. Landscape cover of sagebrush can be a valuable layer because it's important for a variety of species, and it also provides an indication of intactness on the landscape. So what you're looking at here is essentially the sagebrush landscape cover, low 1 to 25%, that light green, and then I'll just say high sagebrush landscape cover, that dark green, greater than 65%. The high breeding bird density areas are displayed in terms of relative resilience and resistance. So those blue areas essentially have high breeding bird densities, but moderate to high resilience and resistance. The red areas, high breeding bird densities, but low resilience and resistance. And just to run through an example or two of how this works, if you look first at A, here we see that this is an area with high sagebrush landscape cover, but low resilience and resistance, but still supports high breeding bird densities. This particular area is one where we may want to consider pre-positioning of fuels and active fire management over the longer term. If we look next at B, we see that this is an area that is primarily characterized by moderate sagebrush landscape cover, and it is characterized by high breeding bird densities, but a mixture of moderate to high resilience and low resilience and resistance. In this particular area, we would want to consider multi-year post-fire rehabilitation and proactive invasive species control. Now, to conclude, I want to just let everyone know that we have developed a series of restoration handbooks and field guides to help managers use these particular concepts. The restoration handbooks essentially provide concepts for understanding and applying restoration across the landscape. They also provide information on landscape level restoration decisions and then also site level restoration decisions. The field guides provide information that allow us to use resilience and resistance concepts to select the most appropriate treatments for pinionate and juniper removal, and then also for determining post-wildfire recovery trajectories and the most appropriate treatments again. And with that, I think I have time for a couple of questions. Yes.
Yesterday, Rick Miller expressed that in those sort of arid Wyoming habitats, which would be the largest land in Nevada, possibly to stabilize the site, create a more seagrass resistant plant community, recommendations was that you introduce species like invasive wheatgrass. Would that be your recommendation too?
Well, there's Rick in the audience. So the question is, for those arid, really warm and dry Wyoming big sagebrush systems, should we be using crusted wheatgrass to stabilize them? And I think that if Rick were in the field, he might say that it really depends on the site conditions. And his field guide actually takes you through the steps that you would need to use to determine what the most appropriate species were and where you would apply those different species mixes on the landscape. So you would need to look first of all at the residual plant community, what species were remaining, what the soil temperature and moisture regimes, and then use that information to evaluate whether or not we had a good opportunity to establish native species. If we have a good opportunity to establish native species, then I think that that would probably always be the best option. And as we're going to hear from our seed strategy presentation, there is a lot of effort ongoing at this point in time to actually develop those seed sources that we can use in those particular types of sites.